This is Craig Stocks, and this is the second in a short series of 5 videos. The first video I talked about the Photoshop interface and some of the principles that you might apply working on astro images or really any types of photos. In this video, the second one, we're going to talk about the structure of an image and some of the ways that you might work with that image in Photoshop. Going ahead in the third video, we'll talk about some of the more of the Photoshop details and eventually get to techniques for adding color to a monochrome image. So let's talk about the structure of an image. First of all, when you first load an image from a monochrome camera, generally that's going to come into Photoshop as what's called a grayscale image. And there are really two main image modes that you'll use in Photoshop, and those can be found under the image menu. And if you look at the mode option, you'll see that you have the option of grayscale, and then further down you'll see the option for RGB. A grayscale image is just that. It has just one channel, which we'll talk more about later. So all it can record is brightness from black, which is generally 0, to the brightest white, which is generally referred to as 255. And everything in between is some form of gray, but there's no option for color. In order to create a color image, we need to change the mode from grayscale to RGB color. And let's look at what's going to happen when we do that. I mentioned channels earlier, and if we look at the layer palette over here, you can see I currently have the layer panel selected. If I change to the channels palette, you'll see that there's just one channel and it's labeled as gray, and it's going to have information about the brightness of each pixel in that picture, ranging from a value of 0, which is pure black, to 255, which would be pure white. If I go to image mode and change this to RGB color, you can see that we now have 4 different palettes shown, and the top one is just an RGB composite. So if I click on that, it's really just showing a color composite of those 3 channels. Now, since this is still a monochrome image, each one of the channels, red, green, and blue, excuse me, are the same. They have the same information. So the result is just a color image. So there is no red, there is no green, there is no blue. But we do have the option now to have different values in these different channels, and that's what will create a color image. I also want to talk a little bit about bit depth. That you have a tool down here at the bottom that you can configure to show different characteristics of the file. I generally have it set to show the color space and the bit depth. And that will also show in the title of the image up at the top. It'll show whether it's an RGB or a grayscale and the bit depth. There's really 2 bit depths that you'll use most of the time, either 8-bit or 16-bit. The difference is just in the amount of precision that you're allowed. So if I look at this simple layer, it's just a white layer, and this is in an 8-bit image. If I go over here to the Tools palette, and let's grab the Gradient tool, and I draw a gradient straight across, it's going to go from pure black to pure white and have all the different grades in between. So it's beginning to look a little bit more like an image. In an 8-bit image, you only have 256 possible values of gray from 0 to 255. In a 16-bit image, you have 65,000 possible values of gray going from 0 to 65,000, roughly. The difference is not that the black's any blacker and the white's not any whiter. The difference is the number of possible grades of gray in between. And for a finished image, 8 is usually plenty. But when you're working on an image, and especially in an astro image where we're trying to pull details out of a very narrow range from the very dark areas, if you're working in an 8-bit image, you'll tend to get banding and noise will be more prevalent. because there just aren't enough different levels to show smooth graduations from dark gray to just a little bit lighter gray to just a little bit lighter gray. In a 16-bit image, it's much more flexible. You'll have more possible values, and your gradients will be a lot smoother and a lot less prone to banding. So generally, if you can work in 16-bit versus 8-bit, you'll have better results and have more flexibility in editing. The downside, of course, is file size. The 16-bit image is going to be larger. In fact, it'll be double the size of an 8-bit image. My philosophy is that the size of an image doesn't matter. That I'll stick my neck out and say that you'll never have a situation where someone will look at one of your images and say, well, the image isn't the best, but it was a small file. So therefore, kudos for having a small file size, even though the image was lacking. People will only look at the image, and storage is cheap. Memory is relatively cheap. There are, of course, some practical limits. You don't want to get completely carried away and completely ignore file size, but for most reasonable applications, I think people put way too much emphasis on file size versus having emphasis on the resulting image. And if file size does become a problem, you can always store those large master files offline and just keep smaller files available. I've talked a little bit about the layers panel over here, and I've referred to the layer stack. And the layer stack becomes important when we start talking about different kinds of layers and layers stacked on top of one another. And in Photoshop, there are really two different kinds of layers. You have pixel-bearing layers and adjustment layers. This background is a pixel-bearing layer because it has pixels on it. Adjustment layers are layers that only adjust what you're looking at below. And you're always, imagine, looking from the top down. We can create adjustment layers just by clicking on any one of these icons, for instance, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, hue, saturation, color balance, and so forth. You can also get to them through the layer, new adjustment layer menu over here if you prefer menus versus icons. If I add, for instance, a curves adjustment layer, it adds this layer on top. In the properties panel shows us the curve, and I can adjust this. The advantage of an adjustment layer is I'm not changing the pixels on that background layer. I'm only changing the curve that I'm looking through to see the pixel-bearing layer. Generally, you want pixel-bearing layers below adjustment layers. So you would put an adjustment layer on top of a pixel-bearing layer, and then you can make changes without ever affecting this background. I can make a big change, go back and forth, and if I want to go back to what I originally had, I can get back to exactly where I started with nothing lost. And that can be, again, very valuable as you're editing. One of the principles that we'll play with a little bit is the idea of clipping an adjustment layer to the layer or layers underneath it. In this case, the adjustment layer is going to affect everything underneath. But I can clip by using the little clipping icon here is one way. I can right-click and select Create Clipping Mask, which is a strange name. I can even hold the alternate key and click on the line separating them. And when I do that, you'll see that it insets and gives me a little down arrow. That's showing me that this layer is clipped to this layer. The effect of that is any adjustments I make here is only going to affect the layer that it's clipped to. That may not make a lot of sense right now, but just kind of file that away because we'll come back to that a little bit in the future. The last thing I want to talk about here is the layers and masks. And we'll talk more about this in the next video, but the white rectangle that we see here is a thumbnail image showing the mask associated with this adjustment layer. And every time you create an adjustment layer, you get a mask for free. What a mask lets us do is hide the effect of this adjustment so that it's no longer visible. And the principle is that black on a mask hides and white on a mask reveals. And right now in the thumbnail we can see the mask is completely white. And just to show how this works, let's make a dramatic adjustment. In fact, let's go brighter. No, let's go darker. It might make more sense. I'll make this darker, so we've made a dramatic change to the levels. I'm going to grab the brush tool, and I've got black as my foreground color. And I'm at 100% opacity and 100% flow. So when I draw on this mask, it's going to draw with a black brush. And I'll use the right bracket key to make the brush a little bit bigger. And as I'm drawing, now you can see the preview over here in the little thumbnail. What I did was draw in black, and it hid this adjustment because it's hidden behind this black mask. If I turn this adjustment off, you can see that it changes, it takes it away everywhere. If I turn it on, it's just hidden by the mask. And we'll talk in more detail about masks and selections in the next video. But for now, I think this is a good place to stop. So thanks for sticking with me so far. And in the next video, we'll talk more Photoshop details of layers, selections, masks, and blending modes.